before we delve into our exciting questions, which will really help flesh out, how Novartis is really leading in the health equity space, would you mind just briefly introducing yourself to the audience?
Sure. So I feel like I probably know 30% of the people who are sitting in the audience, so it's so great to see so many familiar faces. As you heard, I'm Reshema Kemps-Polanco. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Novartis US, a role that I've just assumed in the last 6 months. And then prior to that, I was the head of US Oncology at Novartis. My role is really charged with overseeing the commercialization of 4 therapeutic areas that we've really declared as areas where we really want to go deep and build expertise and really have a disproportionate impact on society. And that is in the space of oncology, immunology, neuroscience, and then we have a unit called cardiorenal metabolic, and that's like putting 3 things together. But these are the disease areas where we really think we can make a meaningful difference. And we're now in a new operating model in the US as a focused medicines company. And one of the things that we're doing now that's a bit different than in the past is really making sure that the lived experience of the patients are really brought into the commercialization much early on, even as early as acquisition or phase 1. And that's really been a really, really positive change. And a part of that is really identifying the non-clinical barriers that get in the way of truly innovative science. And so I'm thrilled to talk about how do we make sure that that's brought to life for all patients to be able to benefit from medicines and innovation equitably and at scale.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Reshema. I'm just going to delve straight in here and ask our first question, which is, despite the advancements in all the treatments and technologies available, we still continue to see tremendous disparities in patient care and outcomes. So what can pharma companies do to help reduce these inequities, and what is Novartis doing in this space specifically?
Yes, the first thing I will say about health equity, because it is such a charged and hot topic, and it really has come to the forefront over the last 3 to 4 years. But what I will also say is that this is not a new problem. This has gone on for decades and impacted all types of people. And I think what has happened, one of the more positive things that have come out of us managing through a pandemic, in the US really going through social and civil unrest, is that the world was on pause, and COVID allowed us to see the true disparities in healthcare when we started to see certain communities become disproportionately impacted by a terrible, terrible virus. And what, out of things that are really bad and traumatic, often comes lessons and things that we can learn, that we can do better. And I'm really happy that I see so much energy around equity, whether you're talking about government or insurance companies, healthcare systems, life sciences companies. This is something that we're all running after. So in terms of the things I think we can do, first is recognizing this is an incredibly complex issue. It's been going on for a long time. There is no silver bullet or no amount of money that one company can throw at it and say we've solved it. So then how do we start to navigate this to make the conditions better for the patients for whom we say we're all serving in this healthcare ecosystem? And I think that starts with public and private partnerships and understanding where different sectors of the healthcare system has that expertise, and even thinking about technology companies, right? We think about the acceleration of AI as well, and how can we bring those things to bear and align all of the incentives to say, these are the areas that have the greatest disproportionate impact in certain, whether that's the United States or we're talking about Africa or wherever, and then these are the things that we're going to do to get after, and it must be a long-term, multi-year commitment. And so I see a lot of great examples of that, which we can talk about as well. Specifically, one I'd like to highlight for Novartis is one called the Beacon of Hope, which we're really proud of. And it's just one of many. We also have an initiative in breast cancer that is truly close to my heart around more than just words. And it's really, if I start with the breast cancer one, because I think it's a shorter story, What we saw during the pandemic was that, and this is a good message for everybody, to make sure you're back on track for your screenings. Don't delay. But if we think about mammograms during the pandemic, we saw an 80 to 90% reduction in screening and mammograms and other types of cancers that are preventable, right? There's likely 4 or 5 of them. If we get colon cancer, other ones, you catch them early, the chances of preventing or curing is much higher. And so one of the initiatives we have is how do we, and so I will say, and then certain communities were even more disproportionately impacted in terms of putting off mammograms. And then there's a gender equity there that, no offense, fellas, my husband would agree with me, but women, we tend to put ourselves last because we are the caregivers. We take care of everyone else, and then we put our own health on the back burner sometimes. And so you combine all of those things, and if you're in a community that is underserved, then we see the rates of diagnosis much later in the cancer stage for women of color, and in certain communities, rural communities, really changed trajectory. And so then the more than just words was really around how do you educate women of color around the screening and what questions they should ask, and also working with the healthcare providers to say, how does that conversation sound, maybe differently from other patients that the physician may have. And so we've had a lot of great success with that one. And then Beacon of Hope, if I could just take a moment to talk about that. So this one is where we've partnered with 26 historically Black colleges and universities, and there's 4 medical schools that we're partnering with. This is a long-term, multi-year commitment to really bring clinical trials to the community versus telling the community you have to go to the clinical trial. And what we know is if you look at certain diseases and you think about guidelines in certain, I'll take cancer again, NCI designated cancer centers, what you want to do is see those same outcomes and treatment standards in the community setting. That's not always the case. And so how do you democratize that? One thing you have to do is to make sure that you have representative clinical trials. And so that's why we're starting much earlier in the development process to ensure that our trials moving forward better reflect the populations for which we serve. And you want to make sure that those trials are accessible, not only for representation, but also to build trust in the community so that you can remove those barriers, whether it's transportation, I can go on and on and on, and get those people enrolled in clinical trials. The second thing we're doing is a mentoring portion of that program, where we also want to contribute to the number of medical professionals who will go out into these communities and work with the patients. And so we mentor them, and we also help to support them financially as they complete their education. And so those are just some areas where we're trying to make a difference in the way that we can. And again, it's not alone. Mm-hmm. We have other life sciences companies who are partnering with us, and other nonprofits who are partnering with us to really scale the initiative over the years.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing such a thorough answer, Reshema. I'd love to bring this back.
Does thorough mean that was really long-winded?
No, that was
I've been told that.
Perfect.
I get really excited about this stuff.
That was absolutely brilliant.
She's very kind.
I'd love to bring this back to your perspective as the Chief Commercial Officer of Novartis US. So your role is obviously in the commercial space. So from a commercial perspective, what is Novartis doing to address health equity?
Yes, so I think I will start with areas, I talked about the 4 therapeutic areas, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you think within those therapeutic areas, I want to talk about cardiovascular disease. You know, what we know about cardiovascular disease is 2 things. And again, an education for the audience here, and something that I didn't know, and I worked in cardiovascular for years, is that strokes, heart attacks, show up differently in women. So if you think about the symptoms that males have, you start to think about numbing on one side, tightness, all the things that we've been taught and we hear about. But one of the symptoms that we find in women is GI symptoms. Mm-hmm. And why is that important? Not that we wouldn't have those other symptoms, but it's important for women to be educated in this area so that treatment is not delayed. And so when we think about how we commercialize our products, we're really thinking about the entire population, right? We think about, is there a gender equity issue here? Is there a socioeconomic equity issue here? And we do business, as I'm sure most companies do, the annual business plans. And one of the things I'm really proud that we started to implement, and now we're scaling, is a health equity assessment in that disease area. So as the teams bring forth their plans, they all have a template. They hate templates, but they all, they have a template, and it's really assessing what are the demographics, what's the socioeconomic status, what's the mix of insurance coverage. It's many things. We try to think about as many things as we can, and then we say, and what does that look like for a certain disease, whether that's lung cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer, cardiovascular disease, immunologic conditions. And sometimes even we see those segments of patients make up a smaller proportion, but then when you look at the negative outcomes, they're driving the majority or 50% of the negative outcomes. And so even that, if you only have a segment that may represent 10% of the patients, but they're driving 50% of the negative outcomes, we have to pay attention to that. And so as we build out plans, how do we think about that in an inclusive way and make sure that our budgets and resources are addressing that? And I think that makes the point of this. You can do great initiatives. Certainly funding and partnerships are needed, but it doesn't really come to life until it's embedded in the DNA of the people who do the work. Because that's then how you bring those lived experiences of those patients, someone in the room representing the patient's voice, we call it patient in the room, to say, well, what about these things? And how might these barriers get in the way of actually getting an important medicine to patients?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Reshema. I'd now love to talk about what Novartis is doing, because I know you're like embarking on a new phase at the moment. So as a focused medicines company, so in this next phase, what are ways in which you are hoping to deliver more equitable impact for all the patient communities out there?
So I think it's building on a little bit of what we just talked about. But one thing I will add to it is, how do we think about our workforce? In talent, and thinking about future forward, where are the areas and diseases that we're really tackling, and how do you make sure that you have the right people at the table with the right lived experience, again, that can bring the patient in the room. So here's an example of lived experience. I started my career as a clinical social worker, and I worked in psychiatry. Mm-hmm. And I still remember, it was one of the most amazing and best jobs I had. I was 12, it was like a long time ago. But I still remember the patient stories, the families, how heartbreaking it was. We participated in clinical trials for patients with resistant schizophrenia or chronic schizophrenia. And, when you talk about, take that for an example, when you talk about an area like that, you can have an amazing medicine, right? That is quite innovative, and I'm happy to see more and more companies also go into this space. But there are things you have to think about very early on in terms of how do you start to remove, you think about it even in phase one, in terms of how you run your trials, what are some of the things you can test that can start to say not only mechanistically who's going to respond better to medicine, but also those non-clinical barriers. What's the situation with the patient that allows them to also respond better to the therapy? What does the condition need to be? And things like food insecurity, housing insecurity, I can go on and on. Those are not things that are typically talked about in that early research phase because we're so excited about the science. And now those conversations are changing because we are being more intentional about who has certain experiences, who grew up a certain way, where did they grow up? Because not only you think about experience in three ways, you think about experience as what's your educational experience, right? You need to pass that bar. The second one is what's your work experience, right? Your professional experience. But the third one I look for is what's their lived experience? What's their story? And what are they going to bring that's unique to the table as we try to figure out this complexity for a variety of patients, for all patients?
Fantastic. Thank you, Reshema. I think we've got time for one more question. So I'd love to, highlight to the audience that you've had an absolute stellar career, beginning with the army and then the healthcare industry as well. So
I've been trying to tell my children this for time, but it's like, I don't know, it's just mom. They don't care about all these fancy titles, yeah.
With your vast experience, Reshema, what advice would you give to someone wanting to grow in this industry and, make a meaningful difference as well in the space of health equity and beyond that as well?
Yeah, and I think even beyond, if you're in this industry, you're in the business of health equity. I think that's the first realization, right? It's not that thing over there. I'm in the business and now I'm going to go work on health equity. And this is why, for me, and I appreciate all of our professionals who, you need that, who have centers of excellence and they focus on that. We need that. I actually think that you also need leaders who are in P&L positions, in commercial positions, in R&D positions, who also see this as a part of their role, like I do, because that's typically where a lot of the influence in the organization and outside of the organization comes from, right? And so I think for someone who's looking to get into this industry, you said it best, meaningful difference. What's your why, right? And really understanding the purpose of this. We are super, fortunate people to be able to do work, worthy work, that impacts society, that impacts the world. And then knowing what's the imprint and mark that you want to make in terms of, doing something, what we call you want to do well, but, also it's an industry where you can do well, you do good, but it's also an industry where you can also do well. And that's why we're very fortunate. And because of that seat at the table, how can you really make an impact and know your true north? What is it that you're trying to accomplish? Making sure that you find people who reflect who you want to become. And I always say, like when I talk to the next generation of people, I think it's important that our next generation sees all kinds of leaders in the most narrow and the most broader sense, because we have to remember it is hard for people to become something they cannot see. And I remember being younger in my career and not exactly knowing exactly what I wanted to do, but I remember the moment something said, I want to do that. And I didn't know exactly what that was, but it was because I saw someone who I thought was inspirational, who I just thought was a rock star, who I thought had great passion and purpose for patients and the work she was doing. And I remember she was 7 months pregnant and holding court, I think she was a brand director at the time. And I said, you know what, I want to do that. And that's really how my career started. I didn't look at her and say, oh, I want to be the chief commercial officer of Novartis US. I didn't say that, but that was, to me, significant work.
Yep.
And then there's so many ways to bring significant work to life.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Reshema. I mean, what an inspirational talk. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Views expressed in this podcast are those of individuals being interviewed and do not reflect any company, parent company, or affiliates they represent.